This is Dr. Carroll, and this is the concluding video in the Python files series. This video is about using a loop to process files. I'll be talking about two different kinds of loops, using a while loop and using a for loop to process a file. This is very common to be able to iterate through a file, and so this will be a great video. Now let's start with the using a while loop to process a file. There are 5 steps that we need to follow to process a file using a while loop. First, we're going to read a line. Can't do anything until we read a line, and we often call this a priming read. You can think like a priming of a pump or an engine or something like that. So this is we're going to start by reading a line. The next thing we're going to do is test if we're at the end of the file. Maybe the file is empty and there's nothing in it. So before we can really do anything else, we need to say, hey, is the file empty? And we're going to do that by, is the line empty? And then if it's not, then we're going to use or process that line. After we do that, then we read another line. And then step 5 is repeat steps 2 through 5 until we're done. Okay, let's see an example of this. So here are the steps illustrated, step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's read a line. So let's assume that we already have a file object created. We've already called open. We already have our try and accept. And so we are reading in a line. Okay, so we're storing that in a line. Now, we need to test if that's empty. So we test the line to see if it's not equal to an empty string, because an empty string is what indicates that the line, that we're at the end of the file. So then step 3 is we need to process that line, and so let's just leave it as a call to a function called process line to be able to handle that. Step 4 is read another line. And so, but we need to read it and store it in line so that when we go to the while loop, we test it. It's the same variable we're testing here. Now, step 5 is just let the loop run. That's all it is. And so there isn't anything explicit to step 5. It's just going to stay in that loop and go through that until we're all done. Okay, now the ordering of these steps matters. For example, we can't test the line, step 2, until we've read at least the first line. Also, a common mistake I've seen is switching steps 3 and 4. That read a line and then process it. And the problem is that ignores the very first line, because we get the line, we test it, we throw it away, we do step 4 and then step 3. There's also the problem that what if this is empty and we've gone to process it and we're assuming that it's not empty. So we need to make sure we do these steps in order, and it's 3 and 4 that I've seen usually mess up. Okay, let's see another example, and as I'm going through this example, look for the 5 steps for using the while loop in this example. So we're going to set up so that we can call exit. We are defining this function, count capitals, and it returns the number of capital letters in the parameter that we pass in. We are using the accumulator method to go through each one of the characters, test if it's an uppercase, and if it is, add to the count and return that count. Oops, we're not really opening it for writing. We're read from it, and so let's apply the accumulator method for the number of capitals in each line, and so we need to initialize our total to 0. So step 1 for dealing with files is open the file. Step 2, we want to make sure that it opens successfully, and so we'll have our try and accept. Now step 3 is where it gets interesting, and where we apply the loop here. So loop through each line in the file and count the number of capitals in that line. Okay, let's see. For using a while loop, we need to read a line. We need to read it from the file object because readLine is a method, so we need to use the dot, the member of operator, the period. And then we need to assign that to a variable, say line, and that's our priming read. And then we're going to read until we reach the end of the file, which may be already, we might already be there. So while the line is not an empty line, that's how we know it's the end of the file, we're going to use that line. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. Let's make sure we've got everything set up. So let's read another line, assign it to line so that our while loop will work. Now let's see. Let's say we're going to pass it to count capitals, and then that's going to return the number of capitals in that line. And so then we can add that into our count of num capitals. And there we go. We close the file, and then we can report how many capitals we found in that file. Let's see an example of this. Here we have calling it Python capital letters, and it found 4 capital letters in all of info.txt. So a capital D, capital C, capital I, and capital B, and that's it. Great. That concludes using a while loop to process a file. Let's look at using a for loop to process a file. So a great thing about using a for loop is that it automatically takes care of iterating until the end of the file is reached. You're going to like this. Check this out. Okay, so here's the syntax. Ready? We have our for and our in, right? We're going to use the file object itself. So we need to open up the file. Then we have file object here. And we'll use line again to make things line up as close as possible with the while loop example. And then we just process that line. That's it. Because this is going to treat this as an iterable and say, hey, do you have another line for me? If it does, it'll copy that line into the line loop variable. It'll process it. It'll come back and says, hey, do you have another line for me? And if it doesn't, it says, okay, we're done, and we jump out of that loop. So that simplifies it from the 5 steps down to this simple for loop. So let's see another example here. So let's go to the count capital letters file, and let's save this as read loop example. Okay, let's see. We can keep everything else the same, but here we need to add in a for loop in. We can get rid of that. We don't need this comment until the end of the file is reached because that's part of it. And let's see, we don't need that one. We need this one, and we don't need to do this line anymore. In fact, it will cause problems if we do. Whew, that was cleaner, that was simpler. Okay, so let's execute it now. Oh, there we go. That concludes it for this series. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out my other videos.